Hi, my name is Jessie Wilkerson, and I am the Stuart and Joyce Robbins Chair of History at West Virginia University. I'd just like to thank the West Virginia Humanities Council for the invitation to speak today, and in general for producing excellent content on West Virginia and Appalachian history. So I'm really delighted to be here. Today, I will discuss the history of women's labor activism in West Virginia and throughout the Appalachian South. I'm drawing upon the research I did for my book, To Live Here, You Have to Fight: How Women Led Appalachian Movements for Social Justice. But I'll also be applying some of my conclusions more broadly for this talk. I have long been interested in the rapid transformations in the gender system in the 20th century United States, and how those transitions intersect with labor, class, race, politics, and family. In order to track changes in gender, I've turned to the history of working class women's activism in the Appalachian South. Appalachian communities have provided an important realm to understand the history of women's involvement in grassroots politics and social movements for several reasons. They witnessed swift changes in the labor system with the development of single industry economies, thus allowing me to understand how women navigated waged and non-waged labor under evolving 20th century capitalism. Their involvement in social movements, including those connected to the federal anti-poverty programs and the labor and environmental justice struggles of the 20th century, provided an opportunity to understand how women in Appalachia perceived and participated in social change. In the 1970s and beyond, women in Appalachia joined and led some of the major women-led movements of the 20th century, including welfare rights, workplace rights, and feminist movements. So today I'm going to start by discussing how I think about labor activism as a historian and researcher who studies women's working class history. I'll then discuss briefly some of the major changes to women's labor during the early 20th century, and then I'll turn to some examples of women's labor activism across 20th century Appalachia. Today, I want to offer some ways that we may conceptualize and think about women's labor activism in the region. So what do I mean when I discuss labor? What probably immediately comes to mind is the image of working men employed in industries like coal mining or steel work. These are men who worked for wages and who we associate with the building of modern America. And the coal miner in particular has become an icon of the American working class. So yes, on the one hand, when I discuss labor, I include these workers and wage work, but I also include domestic workers, farm laborers, workers in the service industry, and many others. And then on the other hand, when I discuss labor, I also include the non-waged or sometimes low-wage work that has been just as fundamental to labor history. And that is the work of social reproduction, or what we might call care work. Social reproduction is made up of the activities and relationships that sustain people on a daily basis and intergenerationally. These activities include raising, teaching, and socializing children, caring for the elderly and people with disabilities, caring for oneself, preparing food, and maintaining ties of family and kin. The majority of this labor, both paid and unpaid, has historically fallen to women. Using the frame of social reproduction allows us to see how work includes not only those activities that occur at sites of production, but also the work that happens within households. The labor of the people who reproduce the working class and take care of people once they are no longer productive in the labor market. Caring labor sustains life, and it also sustains the capitalist system. Yet, as the women I write about argued again and again, capitalist accumulation strained and threatened social reproduction. It created conditions in which care work became difficult, if not impossible, to perform. My work asks us to consider, what would it mean to center social reproduction when we discuss the meaning and value of labor? The women I'm going to discuss today help us to ponder these questions. Before I discuss women's labor activism, I want to map out in broad strokes how women's labor changed in the coal fields of Appalachia in the early 20th century. Prior to large-scale industrialization in the early 1900s, white working people settled on land that had belonged to indigenous societies, and they operated small farms and produced for themselves and the market. Wealthier whites used enslaved labor and hired poor whites in industries, including salt works, iron works, and the tourist industry. As the railroad expanded into Appalachia in the late 19th century, the coal fields opened for production, and many towns sprung up nearly overnight. White, Black, and Central and Eastern European immigrant workers migrated to the region, drawn to the wages in the coal industry and other related industries. This transition to coal production altered the gendered division of labor, especially for agricultural families. What I mean by the gender division of labor is how societies divide labor according to gender, and how that division, at least in Western societies, often produces hierarchies and inequalities. Families in Appalachia that once worked together on a farm as a unit now divided labor, with women maintaining the home and farm while men headed to the mines or other industrial workplaces where they worked for wages. In these scenarios, women's labor intensified as they did more work on family farms, or as they began boarding workers or providing domestic services such as laundry. Others also found a new market for selling their food products. Along with women taking on more work in the home, the work of social reproduction or caring labor also intensified with a transitioning economy. Coal miners and their families learned to live with the possibility of catastrophe in industrial workplaces almost as soon as large-scale mines began operating. When mine disasters occurred in the early 20th century, killing hundreds of workers, women were left behind to mourn and take care of their families. Thousands of workers also faced serious injury, disability, and disease from working in the mines and other hazardous workplaces. Between 1968 and 2014, for instance, Black lung disease resulted in the deaths of at least 75,000 miners. Mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters usually took on the work of nursing ailing workers. They did so without pay prior to the expansion of the healthcare economy, and in the present, women make up the majority of nurses, home healthcare aides, and nursing home staff. To provide but one example, in the 1960s and 70s, labor activist Sudie Crusenberry took care of two men in her family: her father, who was smothering from black lung disease, and her husband, who had been severely injured in a mine accident. Crusenberry nursed her father through an extremely difficult death. She also tended to her husband when doctors said that he would no longer walk again. She worked with him daily, providing physical therapy until he could walk with a cane. This unpaid care work, tending to the bodies of workers who had been ravaged by the mines, occurred on top of her raising and nourishing her 4 children. Crusenberry would later become a leader in the Brookside mine strike in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1973. And she often explained her care work as an important driver of her activism. She believed that unionized workers had better conditions in the workplace, which also meant that women might have to take care of fewer injured people, or that when they did, they had more resources at their disposal. My approach to labor activism is similar to my approach to labor. I include types of activism that address social reproduction and caring labor, not just the class struggles that played out in workplaces. So let me break down what I mean by that. When women in the coal fields engaged in activism, their caring labor often formed an important backdrop for understanding what motivated them, like in the case of Sudie Crusenberry. It's all too easy to think that they were simply supporting husbands if they stood on miners' picket lines or defended striking miners. But the truth is that women often had their own motivations tied to their own labor. At the same time, it's important to note that most people who perform caring labor, which is almost all of us, do not become activists. Yet for those who did, the merging of an ethic of care with democratic struggle often informed women's labor activism in very specific ways. They saw the world through the eyes of people who tended to children, broken bodies, hungry workers, and distressed neighbors. To include working-class women in history and to have a fuller, more capacious understanding of labor history, we must include working-class battles that occurred beyond the shop floor or the mine. I include here activism for environmental justice, welfare rights, and gender equality in the stories about class and labor struggle. We must also always be attuned to how race and gender intersect with and interact with class. Okay, so now let's turn to more examples of women's labor activism in Appalachia. So I realize the mine wars don't need much of an introduction to this audience, although I would like to shift our attention from the miners to the women who did the necessary behind-the-scenes labor as men went on strike in the early 20th century. I'm sure many of you have seen the images from Paint Creek, Matewan, and Blair Mountain, when miners and their families were evicted from their homes and the workers set up tent colonies. During these evictions, women watched over children. They cooked meals, laundered clothes, cared for the sick, and they also sometimes guarded camps and participated in strike activities. Without them, it would have been difficult for working men to carry forward with strikes and union organizing. No person better embodied the merger of caring labor and militant activism than Mary Harris Mother Jones, whose very name invokes social reproduction. In the 1930s, women drew explicit connections between their fight for a union and the care work that so many of them did. Many of you will be familiar with the song, "Which Side Are You On?" written by Florence Reese during the Depression-era labor struggle in Harlan County, Kentucky. You might also know the mythic story of how Florence Reese came to write the famous labor anthem. In the early 1930s, Florence watched from the cabin where her 7 children slept as her husband, Sam, cowered in the hillside cornfields. For weeks, Sam had been harassed by gun thugs, the people hired by coal operators and supported by the sheriff to prevent union organizing with the United Mine Workers of America. Previously, the men had ransacked the Reeses' home and arrested Sam under bogus charges. Now they surrounded the house and threatened to abduct him. As night turned to dawn, Florence's mind turned from fear and anger to music. Lacking paper, she ripped the calendar from the wall and she wrote, "Which Side Are You On?" Set to the tune of the hymn, "Lay the Lily Low," the song called on workers to join the good battle and declared that there is no neutral in Harlan County. Workers could choose the side of the union or the company's crony. She sang, "You'll either be a union man or a thug for J.H. Blair." Florence Reese drew a bold line between the workers and capital, and she asked people to choose their side. That's usually where analysis of the song ends. Yet Florence Reese's verses are based on her own experience as the daughter of a worker who died in a mining accident, the wife of a miner, a mother, a person who did the vital labor of social reproduction. Reese interwove the stories of women and children into the labor struggle. She declared that the company men's children live in luxury, our children almost wild, and that the company will, quote, "take away our bread." The last verse and chorus referenced her father's death in the mines early in life. My daddy was a miner. He's now in the air and sun. He'll be with you, fellow workers, till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Reese and other women caregivers who lived through the Great Depression and the labor struggles of the 1930s often referenced food, in particular bread. Access to bread separated them from the coal operators and their families who lived in luxury. This wasn't simply symbolism. Reese told a story about one of her neighbors who once stopped by her house to ask for food. Reese described the woman as, quote, scaly all over, a sign that she suffered from pellagra, a disease of hunger. As Reese explained, it was a disease she got at the table because she didn't have food. Florence Reese was not alone in her focus on food and hunger. Balladeer, midwife, and labor organizer Mary Magdalene Garland, known as Aunt Molly Jackson, spoke to similar themes at a public hearing in 1932. She exposed coal companies' attacks on pro-union miners and described the impact of the Great Depression. She testified that weekly, 3 to 7 children died of cholera and famine. Other women described hunger, the inability to feed and clothe children, and the stress of living under repression. The stories that women circulated became part of Aunt Molly Jackson's lyrics. In the song Hungry Ragged Blues, she described a scene when husbands labored all day but were denied pay. She sang, quote, all the women in the coal camps are a-sittin' with bowed down heads, ragged and barefoot, the children a-cryin' for bread. Part of the power of these songs is in the portrait they offer of women who did the work of sustaining life. Theirs were story songs about the working class community in general and about the position of working class women in particular. The mine wars and the labor struggles in 1930s Harlan County are often cited as part of American labor and working class history, even if women's roles have sometimes been muted. Less central to labor history has been the war on poverty of the 1960s. In my own work, I argue for the centrality of anti-poverty movements in working class history, as the local people who became key to anti-poverty campaigns were themselves care workers, retired miners, and working people. And this brings me to the story of Edith Easterling from Pike County, Kentucky. In 1964, Edith was a middle-aged mother of 4. She was a cook at the school cafeteria and wife of a disabled pro-union coal miner. She had lived almost all of her life in one holler in eastern Kentucky and had long been involved in local politics. Her daughter, Suella, referred to her as, quote, the unofficial social worker in her community of Marrowbone Creek in Pike County. When the war on poverty started, Edith was poised to get involved. She had ideas about what the war on poverty should look like in her community, and primarily she saw it as a way to change politics as usual. She was soon hired as a paid organizer. In that position, she helped to organize the Marrowbone Folk School, based on the community education model of the labor and civil rights training school, the Highlander Center in Tennessee. The volunteers claimed the mantle of what they called mountain people's power, and they described the school as dispelling the myth that poor people and mountain people were ignorant and apolitical. Participants in the school would concern themselves, in their words, quote, with the massive social, economic, and political problems of the poor class of people in the Appalachian South. Community members and activists met at the school to discuss politics, to spread information about social services, to hold health clinics, and to organize against strip mining, for which they would face a swift backlash. For Edith, the war on poverty was a way to serve her community and to work toward democratic participation in a place where the coal industry had controlled local and regional politics and had marginalized working class and poor people, since the late 19th century. Her own vision of the war on poverty was that it held the possibility of providing working people the resources they needed to gain more power in a place controlled by the coal industry. As an anti-poverty activist, she became a leader in one of the key battles to prevent and abolish strip mining, which threatened her community. Again, I would include this under the umbrella of labor activism. Women like Edith fought against strip mining because they saw it as a threat to their livelihoods, their homes, to clean drinking water, and a safe environment where families could thrive. In other words, strip mining threatened women's labor. In 1968, women like Edith and other Appalachian activists supported the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., a multiracial demonstration that included white and black people from Appalachia, including West Virginia, who called for an economic Bill of Rights. Not long after that campaign, Edith organized a welfare rights information meeting in eastern Kentucky. Community representatives came from surrounding counties and states and gathered to meet with a staff person from the National Welfare Rights Organization, a national group that Black women, including Johnny Tillman from California, organized in 1966. At that meeting and subsequently, community organizers described the importance of coalition building around welfare rights in Appalachia. They saw the movement as what they called a big net that would address the needs of single mothers, disabled minors, poor families, and elderly people. And it would connect with Black lung and disability campaigns, poor people's movements, and the labor movement. The welfare rights movement was fundamentally concerned with acknowledging and supporting the unpaid care work that largely fell to women. Soon after the initial meeting, welfare rights organizations began to sprout up around eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and across West Virginia, led by local women. These groups worked to ease the burdens of poverty, especially for the women who took on the brunt of caregiving. They did so in three primary ways. First, they educated local people about their rights, as well as how to sign up for Social Security, disability, food stamps, or welfare for single mothers. In that process, they learned how to advocate for themselves and others, and how to confront racism and sexism in the welfare system. Welfare rights activist Eula Hall explained, quote, "We wanted to organize just like a union. We wanted to have our own body, our own unity, so we could deal with problems we was faced with. And you know, we were stronger in groups than we were individuals, and we had hundreds of members." Second, they offered an analysis born from their own experiences about why poverty persisted in Central Appalachia. A good example comes from the Constitution of the Eastern Kentucky Welfare Rights Organization that Eula Hall was a member of. That group was made up of single mothers and retired miners. In their constitution, they stated, quote, "We believe people are poor because in this generation or in generations past, they have been denied equal opportunity to land. This happened when coal companies bought the land and mineral rights for as low as 50 cents an acre, even though they knew the true value. The results of this persist to the present day." The group argued that poverty was unforgivable in a resource-rich nation. Third, women led efforts to implement legislation that would redistribute wealth and center the act of care work in policy. In 1972, Shelva Thompson, a white welfare activist from West Virginia, responded to new policies that stated that welfare recipients would be required to enter the workforce in order to receive benefits. This policy denied that caring for children or family with disabilities was work, even if unpaid. Thompson argued that poor women were held to different standards than the rich wives of coal mine operators. She said, quote, The welfare recipient's own duties as mother and housewife are not considered an important duty unless she's doing it in somebody else's home. Those expectations did not hold for the wife of a man earning lots of money, she said. He needs a maid for house and kids so his wife can go to clubs, parties, and church bazaars. Thompson envisioned a movement of working class people that recognized oppression across group lines and focused on fighting the oppressor together. In the summer of 1975, activists rallied around Joan White and Amy Parks, Black women leaders in the West Virginia Welfare Rights Organization, who faced retaliation by the West Virginia Department of Welfare. As president of the Welfare Rights Group, Joan White had campaigned to force out the commissioner, a leader in the campaign to force welfare recipients into paid labor. She and Parks had led demonstrations at his office, and they joined lawsuits to force the department into compliance with federal laws. They also helped to develop a narrative counter to those that demonized welfare recipients as living at the taxpayer's expense. Extractive industries, they argued, sucked all of the wealth out of the region. If policymakers were truly concerned about fairness, then they should pass a severance tax on coal companies. The welfare department targeted these women in what the women's allies called selective persecution. Found guilty of welfare fraud, they faced 5-year prison sentences. White and Parks decided not to take a plea bargain, and instead they chose to fight what they saw as political repression of poor and working class Black women. Their decision made them a cause célèbre throughout the region. Several hundred welfare rights activists from West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky traveled to Fairmont, West Virginia, where the hearings were held. With representatives from the local National Organization for Women and other feminist activists, they rallied in the streets, crowding into the courtroom on the day of White's hearing. When the judge cleared White of all charges, they broke out in song and celebration. When we include these stories of defending social reproduction in our analysis of labor, we can begin to understand how welfare rights organizing across Appalachia stands as some of the most militant and well-organized labor campaigns in the region, even as they faced uphill battles in coming years. In these same years that the welfare rights movement organized, women became integral to the UMWA strikes of the 1970s, most notably in Harlan County, Kentucky, made famous in the critically acclaimed film Harlan County, USA. Dozens of women joined picket lines during the Brookside strike in 1973. Some of them were related to striking miners, while others joined in solidarity because they believed in the right of working people to organize a union. They supported the miners on strike to demand that the company recognize a contract with the UMWA. They also linked the union campaign to arguments about care work, and they formed an organization that they called the Brookside Women's Club. And I want to just talk a little bit about one of the women who was a founding member of that club, and her name is Bessie Lunsford. She was the oldest woman to join the 1973 strike, and she had been in some of the 1930s labor struggles as well. She explained how union benefits ease the burdens of caregiving. She explained her activism years later. Quote, "At Brookside, we weren't striking so much over wages as over benefits and safety. When the strike began, her husband was wasting away from black lung disease. The two of them relied upon the UMWA Health and Retirement Fund for medical care. She said, quote, "I know what a union card is worth. It paid for my hip bone, it paid for my eye, and it would have paid for my husband if he'd had to go stay in the hospital. When we got his pension money, we took it, and we fixed this little old shabby house so it would be warm for him and me." Lunsford described how, during the strike, she tried her hardest to explain to strike breakers why the union was important beyond higher wages. She posed questions to the people crossing the picket lines when they drove past. She said, quote, "Do you have a daddy or a granddaddy that's drawing black lung? Is he sick and unable to work? What do you think is going to happen if you live that long and work at a non-union mine?" She continued, "If you're crippled up in the mines and sitting in a wheelchair, do you think that company is going to take care of you?" The subtext, of course, was that a female family member would most likely support them if they were unlucky enough to be injured in the mines or to wind up with black lung disease. And she would be better able to do that work with union benefits. By the 1970s, women labor activists in Appalachia often perceived their activism as part of a broader conversation about labor and women's rights. For instance, during the Brookside strike, Minnie Lunsford told the story of how she was recruited to the strike when a girlfriend called and invited her to protest. Her initial response was, "Well, what must I wear?" And her friend said, quote, "Wear your breeches." Lunsford then explained, quote, "That's how I come to get started wearing the pants." She continued, "So the phones went to ringing and everybody got their pants on and went out there together to the picket lines." And I tell this story because Lunsford's pairing of the women's decision to join the strike to wearing the pants represents the ways that women, in a moment of class upheaval, also challenged a host of gender norms during the years of the American women's movement. The women of Brookside exposed the gender and class fault lines in the capitalist coal industry. Women's unpaid reproductive labor had, for decades, lent stability to the coal industry as they took on the arduous work of caring for and reproducing a labor force. Their work was indispensable to capitalist production, even if it was unpaid. As the class struggle between miners and coal operators exploded, mothers, daughters, and wives of coal miners argued that the coal economy drained their communities of lifeblood and strained their ability to do the work of caring. For them, the politics of care could not be divorced from the politics of class. Their involvement in the strike dramatized the contradictions of capitalism, that industry relied on the care work of women, yet it created a hostile environment in which that work took place. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Appalachian women gained access to the coal industry and became miners themselves. Between 1973 and the early 1980s, the coal industry went from having no women miners to 2% of the workforce. Women miners challenged the gender division of labor that had long structured the American coal industry. Coal companies routinely turned women away from underground production jobs, and women, especially Black women, also had a difficult time securing positions as secretaries and clerks. As women sought jobs in the mines, they encountered and challenged superstitions about women in the mines bringing bad luck and coal companies' insistence that women would never want to work in the mines. But of course, they yearned for the highest paying jobs in their communities. So as they used new anti-discrimination laws to gain access to industrial work, they also carried their concerns about caregiving into the workplace. Women miners organized effectively through the Coal Employment Project, and this was the primary organization supporting women miners. And they also organized within the UMWA to make caregiving a labor issue. The Coal Employment Project began a pregnancy study, and women miners connected its findings to health and safety issues broadly. They argued that the risks pregnant women faced were not dissimilar to those that all coal miners faced in a dangerous industry, and they used their positions to broach these topics about occupational safety and health in the coal industry. Coal mining women also began to argue for family leave policies almost as soon as they had numbers in the mines. At the Second National Conference of Women Miners in 1979, attendees initially adopted a resolution on maternity leave, before revising it to include parental leave. A group of women leaders then began strategizing about how to convince the UMWA to adopt a parental leave policy, and they quickly began to build cross-sex alliances and won support from the UMWA to call for a 6-month leave policy. They quickly joined the chorus of feminist groups who put pressure on Congress to adopt a national parental leave policy. And numerous other unionists joined them as well. Their efforts led to the much watered down but nonetheless significant Family and Medical Leave Act. Like women in Appalachia in the early 20th century, these women also consistently brought attention to and fought for policies that supported the work of raising and sustaining families. In today's lecture, I've walked through my approach to studying labor activism that centers and values the work of women and those who most often do the care work in our society. We hear the echoes of these labor activist arguments for valuing social reproduction in the most recent and robust strikes and campaigns to support education and healthcare workers, especially in this era of COVID. In the late 20th century, we saw a simultaneous decline in industry and the rise of paid care work, made up predominantly of women workers, although they are paid much lower wages than their white male brothers who were industrial workers. This is the case even as we define them as essential workers in the era of COVID. We should listen to those essential workers about their needs in the present, taking a cue from women labor activists in Appalachia's past. And I would encourage us all to build working class solidarity that meets the needs of working families. Thank you. Social reproduction is a phrase developed by feminist theorists, and especially feminist theorists who are interested in kind of capitalist systems and gender division of labor and labor systems in our society. Evelyn Nakano-Glenn is a sociologist that I draw upon. A lot of her work is on domestic work, especially domestic work that Black women performed throughout the 20th century and how it's tended not to be highly valued in our society. Like I said, social reproduction is thinking about all of the work that it takes to maintain a life. And that concern comes out of feminist theory and thinking about how the labor of women, especially often Black women and women of color and poor women, is valued or not valued. And so social reproduction has been, that idea has been around for a long time, since the 60s and 70s, and scholars have developed a robust theory around it, but I found that it hadn't really been applied to Appalachian history. And to me, it made a lot of sense to consider women's labor in Appalachia through this frame of social reproduction, because we know that being a mother, being a caregiver in the coal fields was incredibly rigorous work. I mean, even keeping a house clean if there was coal dust everywhere, and dealing with mine disasters and disability, that of course intensified women's labor. So it made a lot of sense to me to think about social reproduction in Appalachian history across time. One reason that social reproduction hasn't gotten a lot of attention has to do with how central the kind of image and history of the coal industry, and in particular coal miners, really is. So Appalachia is coded as very masculine, a very masculine place with very masculine workers who are really iconic in American labor history. And that, of course, is really important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on that history and that we shouldn't tell it with a lot of nuance, but it's tended to erase this other aspect of the labor history, especially in the coal fields. So, I think that's partly it. There's also been a tendency to identify women, especially in the coal fields, by their relationships to men. So they are coal miners' wives, coal miners' daughters. Of course, Loretta Lynn, made this famous. And so so their identity is really connected to the coal miner, and that really recenters the coal miner's labor. And even, the Harlan County strike, which is really quite well known, pretty famous. Usually people talk about that strike and the women who participated in it or they talk about the women as supporting men. They're standing by their man. They're standing by their husbands. But an incredible thing is that many of them weren't related to the striking miners. They were supporting them because they supported working class people and working class communities. So I wanted to take seriously that women had their own motivations for getting involved in strikes and labor organizations and labor movements. The title of my book is To Live Here You Have to Fight: How Women Led Appalachian Movements for Social Justice, published by Illinois Press in 2019. And that book touches on many similar themes as I discussed in the talk today. The difference is that it focuses really on Eastern Kentucky, and it traces several women's lives, several activist women's lives from the 1930s through about 1980, and how they were moving through social movements of that period, from the anti-poverty campaigns of the War on Poverty, Poor People's Campaign, some of the stuff I mentioned today, but also the community health movement, as well as the welfare rights movement and feminist movements. But I wanted so the book really kind of homes in on Eastern Kentucky as a site where there was a lot of activity, and I could trace that activity through women's lives. And then I follow them into other networks, as they move into West Virginia and develop movements or campaigns, or Southwestern Virginia, but the focus is more, it's a tighter focus than what I offered today. For today, I wanted to think more about some of the framing of social reproduction and how we can apply it more broadly across Appalachian history. But if you're interested in that tighter focus, the book is the thing to check out. Yes, so this was another thing that I found to be largely overlooked in scholarship on the War on Poverty. There's been a lot of attention on the outsider activists who came to the region, and they were often employed through Volunteers in Service to America and the Appalachian Volunteers. And that's certainly true. I mean, those people did come to the region, and they were working for, through the Office of Economic Opportunity. But at the same time, there were a number of women, a lot of middle-aged women, but some younger women, who were from these communities, who worked officially for the War on Poverty. And they did so in a few ways. So first of all, when these young activists came from outside the region and moved in to help and to work in the War on Poverty, they needed a place to live. And so women, middle-aged women in these Appalachian communities would sign up to host families, and they would receive a paycheck for that. So I consider that working in the War on Poverty, because it was providing housing, providing lodging, but also those women would get involved in helping these younger activists decide what to do in those communities. So if they needed some youth recreation programs, or they needed some support for the local school, so they were kind of directing traffic. They were kind of saying, here's what we think needs to be done. And then several of the women I write about became field workers in the War on Poverty. So they became, part of the paid workforce of the War on Poverty, and then others would, if they were volunteers, they would go on to work in the kind of programs like community health clinics and things like that that were started during the War on Poverty. So yeah, they were very much officially a part of it. And state leaders and local policymakers very much knew that. So the War on Poverty came under attack almost as soon as it started. And those women were often asked to go to hearings or to testify about what was happening. But they were very much seen as part of the War on Poverty. So partly my book is to tell the story of the War on Poverty through their experience, because they had a very intimate experience and often a very powerful experience, because there wasn't much in the way of paid labor for women in many of these communities. And this was a pathway to kind of more professional work for a lot of them. Yeah, so I see a direct legacy from the women that I write about, mostly in the 60s and 70s, to the teachers who organized in West Virginia and Kentucky and elsewhere in Appalachia, as of a few years ago. And I say that because teachers, of course, do have paid work and it's professional work and it takes a lot of training. It is also care work, because it is teaching children and socializing children, and it's really fundamental to our society. It's not about making profits for a company, right? It really is about sustaining our life and our society. And so when I hear, say, West Virginia teachers and 55 strong, calling for a more robust more robust pay and more value placed on teaching, more support for teaching, more support for social reproduction. In essence, I hear the echoes from the past. And really what they're arguing for is a society that values the common good, right? I think of social reproduction as part of the common good, things that we all need and that we all rely upon. And so, teachers were arguing for policies that really support that work. And we know that work often falls to women. Teaching is a majority women profession. And so, yeah, I see direct linkages there. That's a really interesting question. I think the opponents in some ways have changed over time as industry changes. But, I think instead of thinking about it as like, who's the enemy they're fighting, I would say their struggle is more against a system that values profit over people. And that has not changed so much. Sue Ella Kobach, who is the daughter of Edith Easterling, she was 18 when the War on Poverty started. She was one of the youth activists who immediately got involved. And she's also the person who helped get her mother involved in the War on Poverty. And they, as I said, developed this school called the Marrowbone Folk School and talked about mountain people's power. And I bring Sue Ella up because she talks about how at the time they were fighting the coal industry and strip mining and things that were really ravaging the environment and people's bodies, workers' bodies. And today, Sue Ella has been really active. She and her husband, who's a doctor, really active in bringing attention to the opioid crisis, and in particular the role of Purdue Pharma. And she says, it's kind of it's different, but it's the same beast, right? It's a corporation that only cares about profit. That's similar with the coal industry. That's similar with pharmaceuticals. And people in Appalachia were really sacrificed, or at least that's the way she perceives it, that they were seen as sacrificial for these companies to profit. And so again, that's different. Those are different kinds of industries and corporations, but it's a system that doesn't really value what's best for these communities and instead is driven by profit. Yeah, that's a great question about, how much they interacted. And occasionally they did on kind of person-to-person terms. So Eula Hall, who I mentioned, was a domestic worker when she was a teenage girl. And she worked in the home of a middle-class family in her town. I don't know what industry they were part of, but I know that they were wealthy in the coal fields. And so we can make some assumptions there. But she talked about the difficulties of seeing the teenage girl who was the daughter of the people she worked for and what different lives they had. So she talked about their fingernails. I found this like such a evocative image when she talked about it, that she had to do laundry, which in the 1930s and 40s is a really different thing than today. And so she would, scrub clothes with these lye soaps and scrub the linens, and her fingers would bleed from doing this work. And she compared her own fingers and fingernails to the teenage daughter of this household who had really nice, like manicured hands. So I think they're on that kind of granular basis. There are comparisons that Eula made, that Shelva Thompson made in terms of the kinds of lives they were expected to live. I don't know that they came into contact that often, or if they were ever kind of clashes in that sense. Because, to be totally frank, these, when there was a strike, when people were on the picket lines, these were mostly very masculine spaces. There were men on strike, there were the police force, those were all men. There were strike breakers, those were all men, and women showed up to those male-dominant spaces, and these were working-class women. They were never going to see middle-class or wealthier women in those spaces. And in fact, that became a reason to criticize them. So during the Brookside strike, the owner of that particular mine in Brookside, he said about the women, well, I wouldn't want to see my wife participating in those kinds of activities. So he even, speaking about the strike in these very gendered terms, that it wasn't appropriate for these women to be involved. I think, anytime women went into these masculine forms of work, in heavy industry, at least in the 70s, there was often concern about what would be the impact on a pregnant woman. In particular, what would be the impact on the developing fetus? And so those questions came up for women who were getting into the coal industry and becoming miners. And so a study was developed and run by some of the staff of the Coal Employment Project to think about, what was the impact of being underground, being exposed to coal dust, lifting heavy equipment, what would be the impact on women's bodies. And the point I wanted to make about that is the impact on a woman's body or a pregnant woman's body is not that dissimilar to anyone's body. Like if it's not good for a pregnant woman, it's probably not good for any of us. So breathing coal dust is just not great for human lungs. And so they wanted to make that point, that it wasn't that women were less capable of doing this work or they couldn't hold up in the mines by these exposures, but in fact that it's probably pretty harmful to most people, which I think is they use that opening of concerns about women's bodies and women's health to say, well, we should really care, we should really be talking about all people's health, which for a long time, of course, just hadn't been the case in the coal fields. I'm actually working on 2 projects right now. I'm currently writing a book about women's history in Appalachia. So the tentative title is A Women's History of Appalachia, and it will be a pretty sweeping history from pre-colonial era to the present. And I've long wanted to write this book. There are several really great general history books about Appalachia, but none of them really center women's history. And so I wanted to take on this challenge of what would it look like to write the history of Appalachia from the perspective of women historical actors, and really thinking about the history of gender in the region. So that's what I'm currently working on. Hopefully in a year and a half or two, that book will come out with WVU Press. And then I'm working on a book about women's movements in the South and Appalachia. So this will be more of a scholarly look at how the women's movement developed, how it kind of evolved and came to being in these regions where it's usually not considered at all. So the major narratives of the women's movement leave out most of the South and Appalachia, even though I think, as I've shown in my first book and I've realized in much of my research, that women were quite involved in thinking about gender equality and gender justice and what that would look like in the places they called home.